The scent of roasted Arabica beans had always been my fortress. Inside the four walls of my corner cafe, the world was reduced to the predictable rhythm of grinding, tamping, and the hiss of the espresso machine. I was 24, naturally quiet, and perfectly content to let my life unfold in the background of other people's morning routines. I preferred the safety of a pristine countertop and the silent apology of a perfectly poured tulip latte art over the messy unpredictability of human confrontation. That afternoon, the late autumn sun was casting long, lazy shadows across the pavement. I was outside, gathering empty ceramic cups from the patio tables, a damp cloth clutched in my left hand. The street was lulled into a quiet hum. Then, the bell above the door didn't just chime. It violently clattered against the glass. I turned, expecting a rushed commuter. Instead, I saw a storm contained within a sharply tailored black suit. The woman striding toward me moved with terrifying purpose. Her waist was cinched tight by the cut of the fabric, her dark hair whipped into a chaotic frenzy by the wind. She had striking, upturned eyes and a jawline so sharp it looked as though it could cut glass. Her lips were painted a severe, cold red. She radiated a mature, aggressive beauty that belonged in high-rise boardrooms, not my pastel-colored patio. A sudden tightness gripped my chest. My breath hitched. I took a half-step forward, a polite customer service smile faltering on my lips as I opened my mouth to greet her. She didn't slow down.
She didn't speak.
She simply raised her hand, the motion a blur of pale skin and dark fabric, and brought it down across my face. The sound of the slap cracked through the quiet street like a gunshot. My head snapped to the side. The impact sent a shockwave of blinding heat across my left cheek, instantly followed by a high-pitched ringing in my right ear. The ceramic cup I was holding slipped from my numb fingers, shattering into jagged white fragments on the concrete. I stood paralyzed. The world tilted. The burning sensation on my skin was entirely eclipsed by the sheer, incomprehensible shock anchoring my feet to the ground. My vision blurred as tears of pure, unadulterated humiliation welled up instantly, spilling hot and fast over my eyelashes. I instinctively retreated, clutching the damp rag against my chest like a shield, my shoulders hunching inward. I dared not speak. I dared not breathe too loudly. I just stared at her through watery, terrified eyes, waiting for another strike. When she finally spoke, her voice was a serrated blade. She hurled accusations into the open air, calling me a homewrecker, a shameless parasite, tearing down a family I knew absolutely nothing about. Her chest heaved with a fury so dense it seemed to suck the oxygen from the patio. The words were a chaotic puzzle of vitriol that made zero sense to my ringing ears. Before my paralyzed brain could form a single syllable of defense, she spun on the heel of her designer shoe and marched away, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my shattered sanctuary. I didn't look at the pedestrians who had stopped to stare. I didn't look at the regular customer at the corner table whose mouth was slightly open. I kept my head down, stepped blindly over the broken porcelain, and fled into the back kitchen. I locked the heavy metal door, slid down to the cold tile floor, and buried my face in my knees. I wept until the sun vanished entirely, my hands still shaking violently when I finally turned the key in the front door to close the shop. The sanctuary had become a fishbowl. The physical sting on my cheek faded into a dull yellow bruise, but the atmospheric shift inside the cafe was permanent. The neighborhood was a tight-knit ecosystem, and gossip was its primary currency. The narrative had already been spun, packaged, and distributed before I even unlocked the doors the following morning. I was no longer Laura, the quiet girl who remembered everyone's dairy preferences. I was the villain in a soap opera I had never auditioned for. The morning rush dwindled to a slow, agonizing trickle. The regulars who used to linger over newspapers now grabbed their paper cups without meeting my eyes, their coins dropped hastily onto the counter to avoid brushing my fingers. Out of my peripheral vision, I caught the subtle nudges, the hushed conversations behind raised hands, the judgmental glances aimed at my back whenever I turned to steam milk. The espresso machine hissed, but the sound was no longer comforting. It sounded like the collective, suffocating whispers of the street. I found myself retreating further into the space behind the counter, making myself as small as possible. The urge to pull the metal security grate down and never lift it again was a heavy weight sitting squarely on my chest. I scrubbed the spotless counters repeatedly just to have an excuse to look down. Every time the door chime rang, my breath caught in my throat, my eyes darting to the glass. I was terrified of the woman in the black suit returning to finish whatever she had started. I was equally terrified of the malicious, knowing looks from the strangers who thought they knew my sins. I was drowning in a narrative I didn't write, isolated in a room full of people. The solitude I once cherished had mutated into a punishing quarantine. The sun was dipping below the skyline, casting long, bruised shadows across the floorboards. I was wiping down the espresso machine, preparing to lock up early. The streets were emptying. Then, the silhouette appeared outside the glass door. My heart slammed against my ribs. It was her.
Brittany.
She wasn't wearing a blazer this time, just a dark, structured trench coat that made her look even taller. The aggressive posture was still there, the heavy, purposeful steps echoing through the thin glass. Instinct took over. I scrambled backward, my hip painfully colliding with the sharp corner of the pastry case. My hand shot out, desperately wrapping around the heavy metal handle of the steel coffee pot. With my other hand, I shoved into the pocket of my apron, my shaking thumb hovering blindly on the glass screen of my phone, over the emergency dial button. The door opened. The bell chimed, sounding like a warning alarm. She stopped just inside the threshold. The manic energy from our first encounter was gone, replaced by a hollow, brittle tension. She didn't raise her hand. She didn't yell. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her sharp eyes fixed on the floor. Slowly, deliberately, she bent at the waist, lowering her head in a stiff, agonizingly deep bow. 5 minutes, she said, her voice strained, completely stripped of its former venom. The syllables sounded like they were tearing her throat on the way out.
Please.
Just give me 5 minutes to explain. The heavy silence in the room stretched until it threatened to snap. My grip on the coffee pot remained white-knuckled. I didn't offer her a seat. I didn't speak. I simply pulled my phone from my apron, unlocked it, and slid it across the smooth wooden surface of the nearest table. On the screen was a photo of the man I had been seeing for 8 months. Beside it, an open chat log filled with mundane dinner plans, location pins, and his repeated claims of being a solitary, overworked startup founder. Brittany moved toward the table. Her eyes dropped to the glowing screen. I watched the exact moment the final pillar of her reality collapsed. The blood drained from her face, so rapidly her skin took on the tone of old paper. Her shoulders, previously held in that rigid, defensive line, suddenly slumped. Her hands, resting on the edge of the table, began to shake. She reached into her own trench coat pocket, pulling out a folded piece of heavy stock paper, and laid it beside my phone. It was a marriage certificate. The name on it was the exact same name staring back from my chat logs. They had been married for 3 years. The man was a ghost who had built 2 perfectly insulated haunted houses. We sat opposite each other in the dim, empty cafe. The overhead lights were off. Only the warm, amber glow of the display case illuminated the space between us. The anger that had built up inside me, the suffocating injustice of the past few days, suddenly morphed into a chilling clarity. We weren't enemies. We were collateral damage. As the hours stretched into the night, the spoken words were minimal, but the exchange of evidence was deafening. I opened my laptop. She opened her leather-bound portfolio. We began to dismantle the architecture of his deceit piece by piece. He had sold me the narrative of a struggling, brilliant entrepreneur, alone in the world. To her, he played the dutiful, supportive husband managing their joint finances while she climbed the corporate ladder. Then, the final, devastating blow landed. I pulled up the business registration for the cafe. Brittany pulled up a stack of bank statements. The numbers aligned with sickening precision. He hadn't just stolen our time and trust. He had used my name, forging my signature alongside the cafe's operating license to secure massive, high-interest loans from unregulated lenders. Simultaneously, he had been systematically bleeding Brittany's private marital accounts dry, funneling the funds into offshore holding companies. The magnitude of the betrayal hit me like a physical blow. The cafe, The only thing I had ever truly built, the only place I felt safe, was heavily mortgaged to shadows. A ragged, uncontrollable sob tore out of my throat. I pushed away from the table, my knees giving out, and sank to the floor. The cold tile seeped through my jeans. I wrapped my arms around myself, shaking violently under the weight of the impending ruin. Brittany froze. She watched me, her own devastation momentarily eclipsed by my collapse. For a long minute, she just stood there, entirely out of her element. Then, the sharp, imposing woman in the designer coat slowly lowered herself to the floor, sitting cross-legged on the tiles a few feet away from me. "I will fix this," she said. Her tone wasn't comforting. It was an oath. "I brought this to your door. We are going to tear him apart. I am not letting you lose this place." The dynamic shifted. The cafe was no longer just a business. It was a war room. The morning after our revelation, Brittany arrived before I had even unlocked the doors. She wasn't wearing a suit. She wore dark jeans and a simple sweater, her hair pulled back into a severe, practical knot. Without asking for permission, she picked up a broom from the supply closet and began sweeping the patio. I watched her through the glass, a profound sense of disbelief warring with a strange, budding comfort. We didn't talk about the man anymore. We didn't waste oxygen on his name. Our interactions became a synchronized routine of survival. We marched to the local precinct together, a thick binder of our combined evidence clamped under Brittany's arm. We sat in the sterile, fluorescent-lit offices of fraud detectives, laying out the timeline of his dual life and financial crimes. We spent our afternoons entirely focused on tracking the drained accounts and the forged loan documents. She blocked his number on my phone. She took the velvet box containing a necklace he had given me and, without a word of ceremony, dropped it directly into the alleyway dumpster. Inside the cafe, she became a silent, grounding presence. When the morning rush hit, she stood near the end of the counter, handing out napkins, clearing tables, entirely ignoring the fact that she was a high-level executive doing busboy work. My gentle, non-confrontational nature found a solid wall to lean against in her aggressive competence. We were two fractured pieces of a machine that, when pressed together, functioned perfectly. The gossip, however, had deep roots. The neighborhood had decided I was guilty, and they were reluctant to let go of their entertainment. It happened during the lunch hour. The cafe was busier than it had been in weeks, every table filled with patrons, many of whom had come not for coffee, but to gawk. A woman from the boutique down the street, a regular who had previously complimented my scones, stepped up to the register. Instead of ordering, she loudly remarked on the audacity I had to keep the shop open after ruining a poor woman's life. The cafe went dead silent. Every head turned, phones slipped out of pockets, waiting for the spectacle to unfold. My chest tightened. The familiar urge to shrink, to apologize for simply existing, clawed at my throat. I looked down at the register, my shaking fingers hovering over the keys. A hand reached over my shoulder, firmly pushing the cash drawer closed. Brittany stepped around the counter, placing herself entirely between me and the woman.
She didn't yell.
She didn't raise her voice. She simply leveled a stare so glacial it dropped the temperature in the room. "I am the wife," Brittany stated, her voice carrying the absolute, uncompromising authority of a judge reading a sentence. "And the only thing ruined in this establishment is your manners. The man is a convicted fraudster currently under investigation by the state. This woman," she gestured slightly behind her, toward me, "is a victim of his financial crimes, just as I am." The boutique owner opened her mouth, closing it instantly as Brittany leaned in a fraction of an inch. "If I hear one more whispered lie about her character," Brittany continued, her tone dropping to a dangerously quiet register, "I will make it my personal mission to ensure your boutique's lease renewal is met with severe legal scrutiny. Do we have an understanding?" The woman grabbed her purse and practically fled the shop, the onlookers quickly tucking their phones away and turning back to their drinks, faces burning with embarrassment. The silence that followed wasn't suffocating. It was clear. Brittany turned around, picked up a damp rag, and started wiping the espresso machine. I stared at her back, the shaking in my fingers ceasing completely. For the first time in my life, someone had stood in the crosshairs for me. Her armor, however, was not impenetrable. I was wiping down the tables after closing when the sound of a muffled crash came from the back hallway. I dropped the rag and hurried toward the sound, finding the bathroom door slightly ajar. Brittany was sitting on the edge of the porcelain sink, her phone shattered on the tile floor beneath her boots. Her hands were gripping the edges of the sink so tightly her knuckles were pure white. She was gasping for air, her chest heaving in disjointed, broken rhythms. I knelt down, carefully pushing the pieces of broken glass aside. "Brittany?" The dam broke. The stoic, unshakable woman crumpled inward. The truth spilled out in fragmented, jagged pieces. Her family, old money, heavily invested in appearances and social standing, had discovered the situation. Instead of rallying behind their daughter, they had demanded she withdraw the police reports. They told her the man's actions were a misunderstanding, a temporary lapse that all men go through. They ordered her to fix the marriage to avoid public scandal. When she refused, they threatened to cut her off entirely, to sever all ties and erase her from the family structure she had spent her entire life trying to please. She was entirely alone. The people who were supposed to be her foundation had demanded she build her life on a lie. She slid off the sink, collapsing onto the cold bathroom tiles, pulling her knees to her chest. She was shaking violently, the suppressed grief of a lifetime of conditional love finally cracking her open. I didn't offer empty platitudes. I didn't tell her it would be okay. I simply sat down on the floor beside her. I wrapped one arm securely around her shoulders, pulling her rigid frame against my side in a steady, supportive hold. I rested my chin on the top of her head. "I've got you," I murmured into her hair. "You don't need their permission to survive. We're going to carry this together. I am not going anywhere." We sat on the bathroom floor for hours, the silence heavy with the transfer of strength. She had been my shield against the outside world. Now, I was her anchor in the storm of her own history. The following evening, she stood on the doorstep of my small apartment, a single leather suitcase resting by her feet. Her eyes were exhausted, devoid of their usual sharp calculation. I pushed the door wide open and stepped aside. Her transition into my space was seamless. We were opposites in every conceivable way. I functioned on quiet mornings, the smell of yeast, and the soft hum of indie music. She operated on black coffee, rigid schedules, and the relentless tapping of a laptop keyboard. Yet, our routines interlocked perfectly, leaving no room for friction. I learned the subtle language of her care. She realized early on that I was severely allergic to pollen, a fact I had casually mentioned once. She never brought flowers to the apartment. Instead, she would arrive from her downtown office holding a white paper bag from the artisan bakery across the city, containing the exact flaky, butter-rich croissants I loved but never had time to make myself. In return, I learned to read the tension in her jaw. On the nights she spent battling her family's lawyers and the bank's fraud department, the air around her would turn brittle. I would silently place a small porcelain dish of homemade caramel pudding, the sugar torched to a perfect, glass-like amber, beside her laptop. I wouldn't interrupt her. I would just sit on the opposite end of the couch, folding laundry or reading, offering a steady, quiet presence. Late at night, when the exhaustion outweighed the anxiety, we would sit on the fire escape outside my window. Shoulders pressing against each other to ward off the chill, we drank cheap canned soda, watching the taillights of cars blur down the avenue.
We didn't talk about him.
We talked about the suffocating pressure of her childhood dining room. We talked about my deep-seated fear of being invisible. We shared the raw, ugly parts of our insecurities, handing over our vulnerabilities without the fear of them being weaponized. The apartment was no longer just a place to sleep. It was a fortress built by two people who refused to let the other fall. The process of reclaiming our lives was agonizingly bureaucratic. It required a level of cold, mechanical precision that forced us to put our emotions in airtight boxes. Our dining table became a war zone of highlighters, bank statements, and legal correspondence. We spent weeks tracking the movement of the forged loans and the marital assets. It was a tedious, mind-numbing pursuit, tracing wire transfers through dummy corporations and offshore accounts, cross-referencing flight records and hotel receipts to map his double life down to the minute. We operated as a single unit. I meticulously cross-referenced the dates of the loans against the cafe's operational logs, proving the signatures were forged during hours I was documented to be elsewhere, with dozens of witness statements from regulars to back my alibi. Brittany utilized her corporate acumen, slicing through the legal jargon and forcing the bank's fraud department to acknowledge their negligence in verifying the collateral, threatening to take the case to the federal banking regulator if they refused to cooperate. The tension in the apartment ratcheted up when we realized his timeline. The liquidated assets were pooling into a single offshore account, and a one-way ticket to a country with no extradition treaty had been booked in his name. He was preparing to vanish in 72 hours. The adrenaline of the hunt consumed us. We coordinated with the state prosecutors around the clock, presenting them with a watertight, indisputable chain of evidence. We mapped out his movements, his lies, and his financial footprint. There was no panic, only a shared, calculated determination to slam the steel door of reality squarely on his fingers before he could slip away. We were no longer victims waiting for a verdict. We were the architects of his downfall. The courthouse hallway was lined with pale marble and smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. The air was clinically cold. We sat side by side on a heavy wooden bench outside the hearing room. Brittany was dressed in a razor-sharp charcoal suit, her posture impeccable. I wore a simple navy dress, my hands resting calmly in my lap. The frantic terror that had consumed me weeks ago was entirely gone, replaced by a dense, unmovable calm. When the doors opened and he was escorted out by 2 court officers, the moment was remarkably devoid of cinematic drama. He looked small. The charismatic, confident aura he used to project had evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, desperate man in a wrinkled shirt, his wrists cuffed in front of him. He stopped briefly, his eyes darting toward us. He opened his mouth, perhaps to offer a pathetic excuse or a desperate plea. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Brittany simply looked right through him, an expression of absolute, unbothered indifference on her face. I met his gaze without blinking, feeling absolutely nothing. No anger, no sorrow, just the clinical observation of a stranger being led away to face the consequences of his actions. The heavy oak doors of the elevator closed, swallowing him from our sight. The heavy, suffocating weight that had pressed down on the cafe, the threat of financial ruin, the ghost of his betrayal, it all dissolved into the sterile air of the hallway. The assets were frozen. The forged loans were invalidated. The criminal charges were securely in place, with a recommended sentence of 12 years for fraud and identity theft. Brittany turned her head slightly, her shoulder brushing against mine. She let out a long, slow breath. I reached over, my fingers wrapping firmly around her wrist. We didn't smile, but the grip was an ironclad acknowledgement of our victory. We had walked through the fire and dragged each other out. The cafe needed to shed its skin. The space held too many echoes of the past, too many shadows of the time when I was merely surviving. It was time to claim it completely. We stood in the center of the shop on a Sunday morning, armed with scrapers, drop cloths, and heavy canvas aprons. The decision was mutual and unspoken. The old, muted beige wallpaper had to go. It was grueling, physical work. We scored the paper, soaked it, and scraped away the stubborn adhesive beneath. The physical exertion was the best therapy either of us could have asked for. With every strip of old paper that fell to the floor, it felt as though we were peeling away the remnants of the people we used to be. "You missed a spot near the baseboard," Brittany pointed out, a smudge of plaster dusting her cheekbone. She was balancing on a step stool, aggressively tearing a long sheet of wallpaper from the ceiling corner. "I'll get it when you stop dropping wet paper on my shoes," I shot back, a genuine laugh bubbling up from my chest. The transformation was profound. I, who used to apologize for taking up space, was now swinging a hammer to dismantle an old shelving unit. Brittany, who had been raised to view vulnerability as a terminal weakness, was sitting cross-legged on the floor, comfortably messy, eating a slice of cold pizza from a cardboard box. We were rebuilding the walls, but we were also restructuring our own foundations. The cafe was no longer just mine. The sweat, the laughter, and the shared labor had woven her permanently into the fabric of the place. The grand reopening was quiet. No balloons, no loud music. Just the steady hum of the new espresso machine and the smell of fresh paint and roasted beans. The back corner of the cafe, however, was entirely transformed. We had painted the walls a warm, deep sage green. We brought in plush, oversized armchairs, and a low oak table. But the most significant addition was the corkboard covering the entire back wall. It was our mutual assistance corner. It was designed as a safe harbor for women who found themselves standing where we had stood months ago, blindsided by emotional betrayal, tangled in financial abuse, or simply crushed under the weight of an unfair world. We offered a free cup of coffee or tea and a quiet place to sit for anyone who needed to gather their thoughts without judgment. On the first day, the board was blank. By the end of the month, it was a mosaic of brightly colored sticky notes. Some were offers of help, contact numbers for legal aid, recommendations for therapists, offers to review resumes, free childcare for women attending court hearings. Others were simply messages of survival. You are not the things they lied about.
Breathe. Just make it to tomorrow.
You are stronger than you know. I stood behind the counter, watching a young woman with red, swollen eyes carefully pin a yellow note to the board before sinking into one of the armchairs. Brittany emerged from the back office, carrying a fresh tray of ceramic mugs. She followed my gaze to the corner. Without a word, she prepared a chamomile tea, walked over, and gently placed it on the table in front of the young woman. She gave the girl a brief, encouraging nod, entirely devoid of pity, before walking back to stand beside me. The cycle of isolation had been broken. We had taken the absolute worst chapter of our lives and forged it into a lifeline for others. The afternoon sun poured through the spotless front window, casting a warm, golden rectangle across the wooden floorboards. The street outside was a blur of pedestrian traffic and city noise, but inside the cafe, time seemed to move at its own deliberate, peaceful pace. Brittany was sitting at her usual spot, the table right by the window. Her laptop was closed. The relentless, aggressive energy that used to define her every movement had mellowed into a grounded, unshakable confidence. She was watching the street, entirely at ease. I finished wiping down the steam wand, poured 2 fresh cups of dark roast, and walked around the counter. I pulled out the chair beside her and sat down, sliding one mug across the table. The surface of her coffee bore a perfectly symmetrical tulip latte art. She turned her gaze from the window to me. The sharp, cold anger that had burned in her eyes the day we met was a distant memory. Instead, there was a profound, quiet warmth, a look of absolute, unconditional alliance. She reached across the table. Her hand, steady and strong, covered mine. She gave my fingers a firm, grounding squeeze. I smiled, the expression reaching all the way to my eyes, and returned the pressure. We didn't need to vocalize the promises. The words were obsolete. We had collided in a moment of sheer destruction and had painstakingly built a sanctuary out of the debris. The world outside would always be unpredictable, fraught with the potential for betrayal and loss. But looking at the woman sitting beside me, I knew the foundation we stood on was indestructible. The past was a closed ledger. We turned our faces toward the glass, watching the sun reflect off the buildings, entirely prepared for whatever the road ahead demanded. We were no longer navigating the dark alone. We were walking forward, unequivocally, side by side.